Good afternoon, and welcome to the Frank Untermyer Lecture and Award Ceremony. My name is Cami McBride, and I am the Dean of Roosevelt University's College of Arts and Sciences. I would like to acknowledge that Roosevelt University is located on the traditional homelands of the indigenous people of the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations. Thank you for joining us today as we celebrate faculty members of Roosevelt's past and present, Frank Untermyer, Jeannine Love, and Heather Dalmage. It is my honor to introduce Amy Likover, the daughter of Frank and Ethel Untermyer, and the founder of the Frank Untermyer Excellence in Teaching Award. Amy established this award in 2006 as a meaningful way to keep her father's spirit alive. Frank was a founding faculty member of Roosevelt and Professor Emeritus of Political Science and African Studies. The award recognizes an excellent teacher whose academic focus lies in social sciences. Amy will now share a few words about her parents. Amy, over to you.
Thank you, Cami. It is my pleasure to be here today as two Roosevelt University professors are honored with the Frank Untermyer Excellence in Teaching Award. This endowed award is meant to honor outstanding teachers in one of the disciplines my father taught and valued during his 36 years at Roosevelt: political science, constitutional law, African politics, and African American studies. My father, Frank Untermyer, was one of the groundbreaking first generation of idealistic Roosevelt professors. Quote, Professor Untermyer wanted to be part of Roosevelt's mission from the moment he heard about how the university had been founded out of protest against discriminatory admission practices at the Central YMCA College, unquote. Frank came to Roosevelt directly from serving in the Army and after having received his BA at Cornell University. Quote, Untermyer was a friend and colleague of the legendary Roosevelt University anthropologist and sociologist St. Clair Drake, and he maintained many historic papers from their years together, unquote. In addition to teaching at Roosevelt, my father taught at the University of Accra, Ghana, and the University College of Tanzania. He shared Drake's hope that Africans educated in democratic law and history would transform the continent. But it was in his classroom where my father inspired generations of leaders and future teachers. A devoted instructor, he was at heart a romantic humanist who helped students understand politics and law through literature and history. If you were in Untermyer's classes, you knew the Constitution. You knew the Emancipation Proclamation, the Bill of Rights, Alexis de Tocqueville, the Federalist Papers, Shakespeare, Chinua Achebe, Frederick Douglass, Kafka, Mark Twain, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, and Voltaire, among many others. He was an inspiring and motivating educator and a humble man, committed to international education with a focus on democracy. I am certain that my father would have delighted to learn from Jeannine Love and Heather Dalmage. Their work is truly global in scope and significance, and they are apt recipients of the Frank Untermyer Teaching Award. Congratulations, Professors Love and Dalmage. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. We are very grateful for your ongoing support to Roosevelt, and we are honored to help recognize the amazing work of your father. Again, thank you. Today's lecture, Social Justice Through Teaching and Service, features the 2020 and 2021 Frank Untermyer Excellence in Teaching Award recipients. These faculty members are eager to teach and are passionate to integrate students into their research and service. It is a privilege to work with these women each and every day, and it is clear that their top priority is student success. Dr. Jeannine Love is an associate professor of public administration and the director of political science. She holds a PhD in public policy and public administration from George Washington University. Dr. Love's teaching centers student voices as co-creators of knowledge. Her students are guided through iterative processes of reflection and dialogue, and they engage in complex social justice issues. Jeannine intentionally invites students into shared learning spaces, which employ empathetic listening, honest communication, respectful disagreement, and openness to reevaluating one's own perspectives. Dr. Jeannine Love is the 2020 Frank Untermyer Award recipient. Congratulations, Dr. Love. Dr. Heather Dalmage is the 2021 Frank Untermyer Award recipient. She is a professor of sociology, and she serves as the director of the Mansfield Institute for Social Justice. She received her PhD in sociology from the City University of New York. Dr. Dalmage teaches students to see and understand the way injustice works in our world. She believes that without providing students with explicit pathways toward building a better world, they are left with a sense of despair, cynicism, and isolation. Hence why she creates spaces for students to work, learn, and build together in community dreams of transformation. The hope they develop inspires collective struggle toward their engagement in social change. Join me in congratulating Dr. Heather Dalmage, the 2021 Frank Untermyer Award recipient. We now turn to today's lecture, Social Justice Through Teaching and Service. Professors Love and Dalmage will each spend approximately 20 minutes presenting their work. Once both have completed their presentations, they will take questions from the audience. You may submit your questions using the comment features within YouTube, Facebook, or LinkedIn. Jeannine, the stage is yours.
All right. Thank you, Cami, for that introduction. And thank you, Amy, for your ongoing support to Roosevelt and continued connection to being part of the Roosevelt community, and particularly for your strong support of social justice-oriented teaching. Unfortunately, I never had the chance to meet Professor Untermyer, but I know from many of my colleagues who did know him about his passion for teaching and his dedication to students. So I hope that my focus today will honor his commitment to self-governance and dialogue, and especially to centering students in their own learning processes. So the title of my talk in that spirit is Centering Student Voices, Creating a Co-Learning Classroom. And I could alternatively title this Creating a Radically Democratic Classroom for reasons that will become apparent soon enough. So what I'm going to talk about today is this process that I've been going through or working through for the last several years, really, with the goal of aligning my teaching practices with my commitment to social justice. So in really digging in and thinking about and weaving social justice issues throughout my classes, I started to think about the disconnect that often exists between what we teach and how we teach. And I think it's very necessary to effectively teach about social justice. We have to teach with social justice, utilizing a social justice lens and social justice practices. We often push students to critically analyze power dynamics in the world out there, while simultaneously expecting them essentially to ignore power dynamics in here, right? Whether that is in the classroom or in the university as an institution. And so what I've really been doing is walking through the various elements of my teaching and trying to structure an approach to teaching that really takes social justice theory and puts it into practice in the classroom. And that has pushed me to really rethink all aspects of my teaching and traditional approaches to pedagogy and teaching. So this slide kind of gets at that and answering the question for me, or working through the question, there's not really a direct answer of what does it mean to teach from a social justice lens. For me, one of the core guiding principles is this goal of trying to create a radically democratic classroom that centers student voices. The philosophy is directly informed by social justice activism and my own research on participatory, radically participatory democracy, integrative governance, prefigurative politics, social justice, social movements. And so this incorporates a number of elements, including non-hierarchical organizing, shifting to power with dynamics rather than power over, processes of self-governance, employing intersectional analysis, and doing the hard work of self-reflection on one's own positionality and where we fit in these dynamics and these conversations. And so I'm continually working to have to mirror these principles of social justice in my approach to teaching and model these practices in the classroom. And that latter part might be even more important, right? Modeling the practices and processes of putting these principles into practice. So what does this look like? In part, it starts with the approach that I use, which is inviting students as their full selves into the classrooms. The reality is the students are showing up in our classrooms as their full selves anyways, right? But very often their experience in the classroom is that elements of themselves, of their social identities, of their perspectives, of their lived experiences are expected to be sort of set to the side, and sometimes forcibly silenced when they try to bring those to bear in conversation with the course content. So instead, I invite that in and encourage them and support them in putting their own lived experiences and perspectives into conversation with the assigned materials and with one another as part of the analytical process, rather than something that is separate from their analytical process. And to do that, that means using these tools of structuring the courses to foster iterative processes of dialogue and reflection. So there's sort of this ongoing back and forth between engaging in difficult and honest dialogue and really doing the same in terms of self-reflection that is constantly building towards that analysis. And to do that requires facilitating a classroom that builds empathy, and honesty and active listening, and all of that is grounded in trust and then reinforces trust. And that's essential to this approach to teaching. So as it says on the bottom of the slide, the guiding goal really is to empower students to understand themselves as knowledge creators. And the central part of that is to recognize that their voices aren't just important, right? We also often talk about like folks' voices being important, but their voices are essential. One of the things that my students hear again and again from me is pushing back against this sort of refrain that we have in social justice communities, that social justice is being a voice for the voiceless. And I tell my students, essentially that's BS, right? That no one is actually voiceless, but the power dynamics at play, the economic, political, social structures that exist, the oppressive systems that are part of our culture and our society actively silence voices. And so the answer then from a social justice perspective is not to step in and continue that silencing by speaking for, but to create processes that bring all voices into conversation in a meaningful way that is inclusive and impactful. So the goal then is to bring students in the classroom, right? We're doing that as well, bringing all of their voices together in an inclusive way that allows them to recognize the power of their own voices, their perspectives, their insights, and those of others, right? Whether it's the course content, what the materials we're looking at, or one another in conversation in the classroom. And to recognize that they're all knowledge creators and part of this knowledge community, right, as co-creators. So I'm constantly working to facilitate collaborative processes that create these learning communities that support them then ultimately in recognizing their potential as social justice advocates. So that requires shifting roles and emphasis. So in the last slide, I had a bullet point about centering, right, student voices. So as I'm centering the student voices, I'm also simultaneously constantly working to decenter myself and actually decenter the course content a little bit. And that probably sounds a little upside down and inside out from a traditional approach to teaching, right? Where I'm supposed to be the expert, imparting this wisdom, helping students become masters of course content. And yes, I am an expert in the classroom, but I see myself then more in this decentered role as a facilitator, right? Suggesting ideas and concepts and issues that we are going to talk about, posing questions that we work towards answering together, providing course content and the course materials then become the raw materials that students engage with individually and with one another as they seek to answer those questions, potentially push back against those questions, pose new questions of their own, identify issues that I have left out, etc. So in this slide, what we see, right, is that doing that process then really means rethinking everything. So when I said I've been working on this for several years, this is really what I'm getting at, is essentially tearing apart all of my courses and rebuilding from the ground out, right? So changing content, thinking about community, thinking about assignments, and this last one I'm going to talk about a lot, this rethinking assessment. So, in terms of content, just think about, what I was just saying about inclusivity, right? And the importance of all voices coming into dialogue with one another. So that applies to our content as well. What questions are being asked? What questions aren't being asked? Whose voices are being centered and lifted up? And simultaneously then, whose voices are being left out or effectively silenced? Are the sources that we're using multimodal? Are they accessible? Right? Being mindful of this broadly inclusive approach in the classroom and to classroom dialogue also needs to be reflected in deeply inclusive approach to course materials. I'm going to come back to this idea of community, but essentially it's about intentionally building community through what I'm calling integrative facilitation. In thinking about assignments, I really stepped back and started to rethink assignments and what kinds of assignments I use and what are the explicit goals and essentially what is the role of each assignment in this process of dialogue, reflection, and analysis. So I've moved quite a bit to low stakes assignments that foster dialogue and then allow for reflection. So things like Blackboard discussions and journaling and blogs and stuff like that. Students working through review worksheets together and collaboratively working towards answers and sharing their perspectives. And all of these then are scaffolded toward, their little steps in building each student's own analysis, having moments of reflection where they can question what they had thought, expand on their perspectives, integrate ideas that they had never thought about before, and eventually move towards this analysis where they answer the questions being posed and come to their own conclusions. And so those can be, other kinds of assignments that we normally would think of, like research papers or case analyses or what have you. The other aspect of this that is really important I have found is building in flexibility. And that is in regard to how and when students demonstrate these learning goals, and then also thinking about a radically democratic classroom, whether or not students' voices are even part of thinking about and designing those learning goals. The last bullet point on the slide has really been a sticking point for me. Right. So if I've been thinking through content and really doing this work of revising all of my syllabi, and I've been thinking about how to build community for a long time, and now adjusting assignments, and putting all of these into this process of building community, dialogue, reflection, collaboration that works towards creating a classroom dynamic grounded in power with. And then all of a sudden the students turn in whatever it is, the assignment, and it comes to me for assessment, and the power dynamic suddenly shifts to power over. And so this has always been sort of an issue of trying to figure out. And the question is, how do you shift that power dynamic? What else can grading look like? And the best answer that I've come up with is the process of ungrading. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that and how that fits with this perspective and this approach to teaching. I'm going to provide a link for those of you who have not heard of ungrading before. Jesse Strommel's blog has a blog, and this is a link to one of his blog posts called "Why I Don't Grade." And from that, one of the things he mentions, or a comment that he makes about why he doesn't, why he's moved to ungrading, he says, "We have created increasingly elaborate methods of assessment, all while failing to recognize that students themselves are the best and always resident experts in their own learning," right? So it is thinking about expanding our approach to assessment that in a way that is inclusive and brings students into the center, just as I'm trying to do with all of these other elements of building courses. So it's an inclusive approach that centers the students. And I've started to pilot this in my classes across the semesters to try it out this term. And what I am finding is actually that iterative process that I was just talking about, building into the classroom and the way that I engage with students and we engage with course material and one another, is reflected in this approach to assessment, which I'm not sure why that surprises me, but it kind of does. So what I see is dialogue, self-reflection, analysis, collaboration, just like what I've been trying to build across courses in general. The dialogue happens in substantive feedback. So instead of, we often comment on work, but instead of giving comments and then a grade, it's the opening of a conversation. The student submits work, I give them feedback, and then they have the option of revising and resubmitting essentially, and having that conversation continue. That is coupled with self-reflection in the form of metacognitive journaling about their own learning processes, how learning is going, what is working well, what are their strengths, what do they understand, what do they not, what are their goals, and how are they going to meet those goals. And then analysis comes in and reflecting on that pulling together that self-reflection and that dialogue, just as we would in, traditional sort of analysis that I was talking about, in the form of self-assessment journaling. So thinking about what are the conversations, what is the feedback they've gotten from me that they might not have thought about before, or from their peers in the form of peer assessment, what are the insights that they have come to through this process of metacognitive journaling, and then sort of an assessment or an analysis of their own work thus far in the course. And then that moves into collaboration, which is the process of, they say, this is where I'm at, this is what I'm seeing, this is what I think, if I were going to put a letter grade on what I've learned and where I'm at the class right now, this is what it would be. And then we engage again in a conversation around that and come to a collaborative consensus. I've been pleasantly surprised so far about how well this has worked, how seriously students engage in this work when the focus is on collaboration and dialogue and their learning, rather than just working for a grade. And that has been reflected back to me from my students. But as the next slide illustrates, these changes can't work without engaging in our own honest, sometimes difficult self-reflection about who we are as our full selves and what we bring into the classroom. Right? It's not going to work to just plunk these elements into the class and expect it to work. Right? We have to be really purposeful about how we are facilitating the classroom and what we are bringing into the classroom, how we are working to build community, and the ways that we may often unintentionally be shutting down community and potentially silencing students. So I use what I talk about as integrative facilitation. So as I'm saying, this starts with doing your own self-reflection, and then working to build this co-learning, radically democratic classroom grounded in trust by being honest. Bringing our full selves into the class, engaging one another, engaging students and supporting them, engaging one another with empathy, listening with humility, so active listening that reserves judgment and then engages in dialogue, being flexible in our own perspectives and beliefs, and flexible with how the course runs. And all of this really requires and builds to having a sense of connection with the students, fostering connection among students to build that community that allows the framework that is necessary to engage in the collaborative work of co-learning. So I'm going to leave you with a couple quotes with my last slide here. And Marcia Chatelain, who is, next slide, please. Marcia Chatelain, who was the creator of the hashtag Ferguson syllabus, which was a collaborative online effort in thinking about how to weave social justice and specifically racial justice into a class. And she said, essentially she was answering, like, why should we have these co-learning classrooms for social justice? And in particular, when doing so means facilitating and engaging in what can often be very difficult and emotional conversations. And she said, students are seeking to engage with intelligent questions, honest reflection, and inspiring moving forward, right? You need to be able to go through these processes and able to inspire to go out and do the social justice work. And the last quote I'm going to leave you with is, again, from Jesse Strommel, who in talking about this approach overall to teaching, says his teaching philosophy is to, quote, start by trusting students. Thank you. And with that, I will turn it over to Professor Heather Dalmage for her portion of the presentation.
Unmuted now. So I just want to say thank you to everybody that worked to bring this together. Thank you for Amy. I had the pleasure of meeting her earlier and hearing about her experiences as a child in the hallways of Roosevelt University, and something I think someday my children will talk about. Listening to Dr. Love just now, I promise you she and I did not coordinate our PowerPoint presentations and what we're talking about, but I really understand why my students during the context of our classes talk about Dr. Love and Dr. Farmer, Dr. Long, Dr. Jollis. These are some of the names I hear all the time because there's so much overlap in our approach to pedagogy as well as our dreams for our students' transformation. So what I am going to talk about is hope, both as a practice and a philosophy, and why hope matters in terms of our pedagogical approach. I'll start with a definition. Hope is the knowledge that we matter. And I want to be really clear about hope because I think sometimes folks think about hope as something that we can give hope, we can keep hope, hold it. Go to the self-help aisle and find a book on hope. Hope is the knowledge that we matter. So I'm going to read just a quick piece from Rebecca Solnit on what hope is not. And then I'm going to come back and talk a little bit about moving forward relative to hope and pedagogy. Rebecca Solnit says, hope is not the belief that everything was, is, or will be fine. The evidence is all around us of the tremendous suffering and tremendous destruction. Hope that I'm interested in is broad perspectives with specific possibilities, ones that invite or demand that we act. It's also not sunny, everything is getting better narratives, though it may be a counter to everything is getting worse narratives. And the reason that I think that we need to keep hope central to our pedagogies, especially those of us in the social sciences, is because we are giving our students tools, disciplinary tools, to see the suffering, to see the injustice, how it's structured. And if we do that, only giving the tools to see without also moving forward and building in hope, we will lead them on a path towards cynicism and despair. So I have 15 minutes, which in some ways feels like, to a sociologist, a bumper sticker, but I am going to try to talk about both the philosophy, why hope needs to be infused, as well as how I approach the classroom with hope central to my pedagogy. And listening to Dr. Love just now, we may use different terminology, but I am very conscious that we're moving in such similar pedagogical ways. Next slide, please. Okay, so I am I consider myself a Freirean scholar. I was trained in graduate school as a graduate teaching fellow with Ira Shore, who wrote A Pedagogy for Liberation with Paulo Freire. I've had wonderful opportunities learning pedagogy in the context of community and reflection. So I understand it personally as a student and as a professor. So I'm coming to this with that background. I do think that we need to, in the context of our pedagogy, in the context of our classroom, invite the students to the table, sit together in dialogue, and in that rigorous space, and investigate, understand, learn about one another's humanity and in that process, engage together in the process of transformation. Of course, dialogue requires awareness. And for that reason, before we can even get into these moments of engaging with one another, trying to understand our experiences relative to these theoretical concepts we're learning, I begin every class with an acronym that it's GRECSO, G-R-E-C-C-S-O, GRECSO. And that stands for gender, race, ethnicity, class, citizenship, and sexual orientation. In sociology, we refer to each of those categories as social location. They're locations that we're born into. Society is structured in these ways. We don't have a choice. And at the same time, as we're raised into society and those categories are imposed on us, we do have opportunities to resist, to think critically about those categories. But oftentimes they're internalized and become the identities that inform the way we interact in the world. And so through dialogue, we can begin to consciously explore the context in which our identities, our ways of knowing, have been created, and then also to be able to critically reflect upon how those identities inform actions and the impact that our actions then have on the world. Many times people consider themselves nice, a lot of nice people in the world, but without the ability to critically reflect on who we are and understand, given the context of the world, sometimes being nice people and just acting in these ways can create oppression and suffering for others, even though it's not intended. And so when we engage in dialogue, there has to be, and Dr. Love talked about this, the space created where we really listen to one another. We trust what somebody else is telling us, that we have the courage to speak to one another. And that happens when we can understand the sort of the fullness of what we're bringing to these dialogues. Next journal, please. So I want to, similar to Dr. Love, talk about the space as important to the pedagogy, important to making it, shifting the balance of power so that students are centered and able to engage in these dialogues in this moment. And for this next piece, I'm drawing on a journal article that I wrote with an alum of ours, Samantha Martinez, published in 2019. She's a 2018 social alum, where we were in dialogue in this article, understanding what a critical pedagogy, what a liberatory pedagogy in a university classroom, how that experience is how it's experienced from the location of the professor and the student. The article is called Location, 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 Pedagogy in a University Classroom. So first I want to say, walking into a classroom, I would encourage all of us, and I think we do, ask this of ourselves: what is our goal as an educator? And then encouraging our students to think about what is their goal. As university professors, we have, in a sense, made it. And I think that we have an obligation to our students to give them whatever tools they need to make it, whatever that means to them in society. And so approaching the classroom in that way, I encourage my students to talk about what are their dreams for the future, and then really begin to explore what are those dreams. So here's how we get there. First, I want students to talk directly to one another. And this isn't always easy, given the various ways students have been silenced over time, but also sometimes the structure of the classroom itself, the issue of grading and power relations. So initially, on that first day of class, there is the process of allowing students to talk face to face, seeing one another's faces, hearing their voices, their names, turning however they can in the classroom, given the context of that exact space. And then next, I begin to press the students a little bit, asking them why it is they're willing to come into a classroom, 30 to 50 students, and just look straight forward, waiting for me as the professor to talk to them. Why don't they make moves to change the dynamic of that space? What's at stake there? What is in their past they're learning about this way of doing education? Is it effective for them? And so basically, we're going through these questions of getting them to reflect on their learning and the space in which that learning is taking place, giving them space to question themselves as a learner and what that means. And so we absolutely take on our social locations, the physical context of the classroom. And then in the looking at the piece that knowledge is something that is constructed, we then explore dialogue and silence explicitly. Invariably, every semester, there are some students that do not speak, and there's students that are over speakers. We address that. What is in the silences? Why are we silent? What is it in our past that we've learned? What is it in our present? Are we afraid? Are we have we been taught not to question, not to speak? And then we move into what it means to remain silent and the connection to having voice, knowing our social locations, feeling that power and agency of knowing who you are and why you believe what you believe. And then laying that back over silence again and again. And so we keep exploring what is happening, making space for that constant process of reflection on their own and reflection in the context of dialogue with one another. And then finally is the question of our awareness of who we are. How are we seen by others? Who do we see? Who do we not see? Who are the people we call community? The people that when they speak, we trust them and we listen to that knowledge. And who are the people we don't even know their stories? And why don't we know those stories? And are there people that when they speak, we don't really trust what they're saying, and why is that? So again, there's these moments of constantly putting forth what it means to be in community, each of the pieces, as we're building the space in the classroom, and just like Dr. Love, making sure that we're inviting that reflection, both personal reflection and then in the context of community and dialogue. Now, what starts to happen is once students begin this process of dialogue and begin the process of finding their voice and understanding the context of the world, they get very excited. It's this moment of personal transformation. And then it happens. They go home on break and they're excited, and this transformation is happening, and they're in a community, in a classroom space, and they go back home. And those ideas aren't landing in the same way, perhaps. Their friends may not be connecting in the same way. And the students begin to worry that, yes, they're seeing their personal transformation. And while they're in the university, they're having this experience. But now there's the potential of being isolated, being pushed out of those communities that have raised them all along. I've had many conversations in my office with students grappling with this. And I think this is the important piece here, that the pedagogies that we engage in at Roosevelt University, and especially those of us who center social justice in everything that we're doing, we're seeing our students transform, and then we need to take that next step and show them how this, and help them along the way. What are the tools for moving through personal transformation towards social transformation? What does that mean for how we build community, who we call our people, and how do we continue to hang on to our families and our communities even as we're transforming? And this is something that I have found that worries students the most, is that they are going to lose connections and not know how to move forward. Next slide, please. So like Dr. Love, I've spent a lot of time thinking about how do we do this in community? I think learning in the process of community, any form of evaluation of student learning that we can allow them to do in the context of community and dialogue is wonderful. And so we're a university. How do we create these community spaces so that they're learning from one another, that we as the faculty are learning from them, that these processes are going all different directions. And as they're building community, they're also dreaming together new ways of engaging in the world. So some of the ways that we do that, of course, is in the ways that Dr. Love described in her classroom, the things that I'm trying to do in my classroom and so many of our colleagues. In addition to that, we have events that we put on and workshops, all with an eye to getting students engaged with social justice at the center of their community building, the hallways. But in larger, more structured ways, also traveling with students, doing faculty-led courses where we go to other countries and we bring the topics, what we're engaged in, and students travel together for up to a couple of weeks. I have found the most profound transformation happening in this context when the students are together, very much alive and engaged in what it is that we're grappling with, the ideas that we're grappling with. And when we think about this way of building community and learning from one another, then it becomes very clear that it's both a space and it's a process. It's that process of finding our people, the people that keep us strong, that give us hope in humanity, that will dream transformation with us and be there to build new worlds. So some of the examples, just to walk through this slide quickly, we have here, we traveled to South Africa. I think the first trip was in 2012. And in the upper left-hand corner, you see 3 students pointing up at the flag. These 3 students are Mexican-American women, all graduated now. And we were at Marapang, which is the cradle of humankind. And there next to the South African flag was the Mexican flag. And so it was just one of these really wonderful moments of seeing the connections in the world. And next to that particular photo is a photo of the partition wall in Belfast between the Protestants and the Catholics. And this was a trip Professor Cusack and I took students looking again at global whiteness to the UK and in the Republic of Ireland. And here is a recognition of the struggle for liberation, Nelson Mandela on the wall in Ireland. So again, making these connections. And the others, students having dinner together, processing a day of being out in communities. So next to the one of Nelson Mandela is a group of students in Durban. And then on the bottom, we have students in the Blue Mountains in Australia, because not all social justice work has to be like this drudgery. And, we have to have fun and we have to have humor. And that's our humanity too, and creativity. Next to that is student G. Jordan, an alum now, meeting students in Kalitia, which is a township outside of Cape Town. And this is in a school for deaf children. So I will say, relative to, and sort of wrapping up this idea of creating these spaces for students to learn in community, I see this as a really intense, transformative space. I have Ella Baker there, the great Ella Baker from, Black freedom movement, civil rights movement. The question she used to ask people is, who are your people? And in that question, she's saying, again, who do you trust? Who are you bringing around you? Who are you asking questions with, joining arms with as you dream transformation and bring hope to your life? It's a question I think that we all need to reflect on. And again, it's who do we see, who do we believe, trust, and what knowledges do we accept as knowledge? And then under that, I included Ubuntu because I think this is an important philosophy. I am because we are. And it's something that when we're looking at building community and bringing students together in the process of learning, contrary to the US, where students are raised with radical individualism and, they're going through standardized testing and competing for grades, and they're learning I am because I am engaging in this alienating work to get to the next level so I can engage in more alienating work so I can get a degree so that I can get a job, et cetera, et cetera. And what we're doing is trying to flip that script and say, look, we are, any individual, we are because we all are. And so we make that very explicit in the context. Next slide, please. One other way that we have looked to build community is in the process of using cohorts. And here I just want to say thank you to the Mansfield family, Bonetta, Mimi, Alexis, and then at Roosevelt University, Jared McCarty, Cami McBride, LaDonna Long. Together, we are launching the Fellowship for Activism and Community Engagement. This builds on, the acronym is FACE, and it builds on this idea that we're turning toward one another, we're facing one another, and on Cornel West's idea that justice is the public face of love. And that is social, personal transformation. That's ultimately where I see this going. And so this fellowship that we have set up is going to allow 15 Roosevelt students, rising juniors, to come together in a cohort, learn about the theories of social justice, advocacy, activism, abolition work, learn about that, and then engage in the community practice and paid internships, all while coming back together and talking about these experiences, processing them individually, and then being able to come together in dialogue and processing them together. Next slide, please. And just to, as I'm coming into concluding my remarks here, I really appreciate this particular quote from Maria Popova, a Bulgarian-born American writer. Critical thinking without hope is cynicism, but hope without critical thinking is naivete. Next slide, please. I am so lucky to be where I am in the world. I am grateful beyond words to be on faculty in a university that is built on a mission of social justice, with the history of faculty that were brave enough to walk out of one university that was unjust and begin a new university, some with their own personal finances, putting their own futures and their families' futures on the line as the origin of this university. And then with so many colleagues, you've heard Dr. Love, I feel like Jeannine and I are just two of so many engaged in this process. And I'm just happy to be in this space and working with students that are amazing. I also believe that at a time when the liberal arts are under attack by those who are diminishing the importance of education and clinging to populism, I think that there is no important move at the moment than helping human beings to think critically about themselves, community, and dreaming transformation. Thank you so much. And now I'm going to turn it over to my dean, Cami McBride.
Thank you so much, Heather and Jeannine. Your presentations were really inspiring. It's very clear that your work has earned you this award, and I'm also confident that our students will be able to benefit from your excellent work in the future. I'd like to invite our guests who are watching via Facebook, YouTube, or LinkedIn to put their questions in the comments, and our presenters will be happy to address them. I'll be sharing those questions with them. I will start with the first question. One thing I was wondering as you were both presenting is, do students ever resist this process? So Jeannine, you spoke about a radically democratic classroom. And Heather, you talked about students being worried about this transformation. So how do you address that if students sort of are so accustomed to traditional ways of teaching where they are passive recipients? How do you help them to think differently about how their experience may be? Either one or both.
I'll jump in. Why not? And I think you started to actually give what I was thinking of as the answer to that question, Cami, of them being less about being resistant and more about being hesitant, of having experienced, for many of them, their only experience, has been in these kinds of classroom dynamics where that is what is expected of them, is to be passive recipients of knowledge, right? So I didn't directly invoke Paulo Freire in my talk, but clearly both Heather and I are influenced, have similar influences there, right? And so they've had that, what he called banking, experience in education of like, I'm just going to deposit the knowledge in, and then I'll memorize something and I'll spit it back to you and you'll tell me whether I'm right, and then I'll move on to my next class and I'll have a grade, right? And so it really does take some careful thought to think about how to bring folks in. Also, it may surprise folks to know that I'm extraordinarily introverted. So I always tell my students I was the student in the back of the class who never said a single word all semester long, and then would write whatever my paper was and turn it in and be like, there you go, right? And so I'm really mindful of that when we are creating the spaces of dialogue, that we need to recognize that students have different comfort levels and different ways that that engagement works for them, right? So that's part of why I build in things like the discussion board post, which I use in a really strategic way. They're due before class, and I use them to shape class. So what they talk about in discussion boards actually shapes the content of the class that day. It's immediately put into practice and shapes our conversations. But it allows folks who are less verbal, right, and more internal with their thought processes and work better through writing to reflect that way. So I think creating different ways of engagement, this is also what I was getting at with flexibility in the classroom, and just genuinely engaging them when showing that you respect their ideas and what they're bringing to the class, and working to sort of draw them out. And it can be a process, and different students will have different experiences in that process. But I think that resistance tends to be more an aspect of hesitancy, and it's on me as an effective facilitator to figure out how to create a community that works for everyone.
Oh, that's interesting, Jeannine. I'm going to add I agree with you. I'm going to add a little bit of a different spin, how I've been seeing it. And that is that I think students have fear of speaking. So that hesitancy is driven by a fear, either the way that they've been socialized. But what prompted me to write this piece with a student was a student that was very, very quiet. And we began then this discussion of what causes that, and discovered then in the context of playing it back before a lot of students is this idea that their parents have worked so hard to get them to college, and they know they've got the formula for how to make it, and that is you sit in a classroom, you memorize, you regurgitate, and them making it is them being responsible to their parents and their community. And so they feel like they're going through this personal transformation, and they can see that method of pedagogy is really leading to the reproduction of oppression and injustice. And yet to step off that path is somewhat intimidating and problematic. The other is I have to reflect on myself when the students are being silent. And I used to say over and over to students, travel, you need to travel, you need to see the world, until a couple of DACA students said to me, we can't travel. And I realized, boy, how imposing my voice can be about here's how you're going to do this, and here's the path. And so it's those moments of reflecting on ourselves. So I'll leave it there. Yeah.
Thank you both. That's very helpful. We have a question from our viewers. What personal life experience has shaped your teaching philosophy the most, overall or specifically something that may have occurred at Roosevelt?
So I'll go first again. We'll just continue with this order maybe. Yeah, oh, that's an interesting question. And for me, I think it's actually a very personal answer, in that, the work that the courses that I teach are naturally, lend themselves to having difficult conversations around social justice issues, right? I'm teaching poverty policy and food justice and intro to social justice and, all of these types of courses. And I was doing this work of inviting students into the classroom, right, as their full selves and fostering this honest and reflective engagement, right, and realize, that I was asking them to bring themselves into the classroom. And one of my epiphanies sort of in this process was when my partner died in 2012. And my first semester back, I really hid that from my students. I was worried about sharing that aspect of my lived experience and how they're talked about, like how we're perceived, right? How that might shift the way that they perceive me, right? Because I was still very much in the throes of grief. And obviously that affects all aspects of yourself, including your pedagogy, right? And I was worried about bringing that in and being honest. And then, like the next semester, I was let that go a little bit. And, in my poverty policy class, one of the things I open up with is my lay partner was a Medicaid recipient. I was a caseworker. I worked in, policy think tanks. So I talk about sort of this lived experience on different, from different angles of what we're talking about in the semester. And I started to realize that, talking about him, talking about his disabilities, talking about our struggles, talking about my grief, right, bringing that, when appropriate, right, into the classroom, when it connects with what we were talking about, was actually really powerful and ends up being a way of modeling what I'm asking of them, right, that I am asking them to bring their full selves into the classroom and to, when we're engaging in these really difficult conversations, students are really sharing with one another, really personal and deep elements of their lived experiences and their social identities. And that, I should, if I'm asking that of them, right, I should be creating a space where I am not separate from that. I'm facilitating that, and I'm part of that process of co-creating that space with them. So I think those kind of together, doing the research that I do on participatory democracy, the courses that I teach that are so centrally grounded in social justice, and then that reflecting on how my own lived experience, I bring that into the classroom and can connect with students through that. All of those kind of come together to inform this approach that I have to teaching.
Thank you for sharing that, Jeannine. Heather, how would you answer?
I think for me, it's a longer term what got me here, but ultimately the moment of realization was when I read A Pedagogy for Liberation in my first year of graduate school. And I remember just sitting with that text and being so angry that I had been robbed of a real education for 12 years, that I had not been given the tools to be liberatory and personally transform and think in those ways. So that was the moment for me, for sure.
Yeah. I have another question, and this might require some deep thinking. How do you move from the fear of speaking and changing the hierarchy within the classroom towards developing leadership qualities and expertise in governance for the next generation?
That's an excellent question. Jeannine, would it be okay if I jumped in on this one? Yeah. So this is exactly what we're trying to do with FACE. I think this is such an important question, and it absolutely. Let me just take this again. I apologize. I'm a sociologist. I always feel like it's my cover for having to give context and context and context. But when I first started engaging in teaching, I was in the City University of New York, and I was realizing as a professor, I needed to give my students cultural capital in order to make it in mainstream society. And at the same time, that cultural capital, what they need in order to speak in the way the dominant want people to speak, etc., we need to criticize that. So I wrote a piece on teaching cultural capital as both the rules that need to be followed and something that we need to resist. So now what I see happening with our students and with what's going to be happening with FACE, they're going to be engaged in the community, actually engaged in learning the skills to make it, and at the same time critically analyzing that while they're thinking about how they want to build community. So I do think that hands-on experiential learning is central to this particular question of how do we help them do that.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think that moving from the fear of speaking, first of all, is getting through that fear of speaking, right, through some of the pedagogical approaches that Heather and I have been talking about. And it was interesting as Heather was giving her presentation and talking about, I've had similar conversations with students about how they go home and then they come back and they're like, oh my gosh. But part of that conversation that I often get is actually because of the way that we engage with these conversations in the classroom and break things down and really think through systems of privilege and oppression and how they work and how do you talk to somebody. One of the questions I ask my students is like, how do you explain privilege to somebody who is resistant to that concept, right? Like, how do you explain systems of oppression to somebody who is resistant to seeing them at work? And that process of working through that and having these conversations with each other and really listening to each other, they take those tools home. And I've had similar kind of conversations, but from the other direction where a student comes home and is like, oh my God, I had the most productive conversation with my uncle that I've ever had at Thanksgiving, right? Because they learn not only how to, to speak up with their voice, but they're also how to engage and listen, proactive, active listening, and create these spaces of productive dialogue. And I think that learning those skills and having those tools, right, of being able to connect, particularly with folks across differences, sometimes really deeply divided differences, is something that is essential for developing these leadership qualities and governance and pushing social justice issues forward, right? Like, so Heather was talking about like, who are our communities, and hopefully the idea of like, who are our people, right, is that we can continually expand that rather than becoming isolated and siloed. And so I think that these practices that we engage in the classroom, the ways that we approach dialogue that Heather and I have talked about really help build those skills.
I just want to clap when you finish speaking. Can I say?
Me too, Heather. Me too.
I'm going to piggyback on that just slightly, a bit. And now I've lost my train of thought, so I won't be piggybacking, but I'll come back. And oh no, it's back. So what I tell our students all the time about that difference is Roosevelt is so unique when you think about the difference that is in a classroom. Mm-hmm. And then for them to be in this moment of their life where they're learning, they're going from sociology to political science to history to whatever. And so they're bringing all these tools together, and then they're coming together across all these differences. There's no other space like it, and they'll never have a space like this again in life. So it's such an opportunity. So I agree, Jeannine. I hadn't put it together with going home and that skill, but you're absolutely right. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm sure this is very helpful to those watching. One related question, I think what you've just been speaking about is sort of how does this approach have application outside of the classroom? How could it be applied in perhaps very hierarchical places like the workforce, in offices or other organizations? What are your thoughts?
I'm going to jump in on this one. I hope you don't mind, Heather, because I saw that one come up in the queue, and I'm excited about that because I teach public management. Right, that's one of my courses that I teach in regular rotation. And so I've been grappling with that exact question of how do I create this space, not only for learning in the classroom, but helping students develop these skills that they can then take out into the workplace, into the organizations. So this is for public service, so nonprofit organizations, government institutions, et cetera. Healthcare is another concentration that we have. And really purposefully weaving in social justice analysis of the workplace. And really what it comes down to is really thinking about how to translate these skills and this way of interacting and this intersectional lens and this deep self-reflection into all aspects of an organization. And that often translates into transformational leadership practices and really working to shift an organization's climate. One of the things that we talk about, again, we talk about DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion in our class, and that's really woven throughout this course and the material that we talk about and the conversations that we have. And one of the things that we really focus on is that very often organizations will try to shortcut this, right? They will, we're going to have an office of diversity and inclusion, or they're going to have this, one training session that folks have to do or whatever, right? Like it's sort of like what I was talking about with my approach to teaching, that you can't just plunk one of these things in, you have to build the whole structure, right? And so it's similar in taking this out and putting it into any workplace dynamic, is that you have to shift the structure and the culture of the organization itself. And that is very intense, long-term dedicated work that has to happen. So we talk about like, what are the levers in an organization that sort of shift those dynamics, and how can they use these tools that we are utilizing in the classroom in the workspace?
Thank you. Heather, would you add anything?
I think just reiterating that helping students to consciously choose their path so that they understand if, for instance, they take a position in the federal government, even in some civil rights office, and they think that is going to be a revolutionary move, they might be disappointed once they get in there. So it's helping students understand different ways that social justice can be mobilized as an advocate, activist, and what it means to be an abolitionist, so that they can see all of these different places. And as they're trying to survive in a society that cares little for social welfare and has little of a safety net in place, that they're making conscious moves, even if they take that job in the federal government. And that's not to disparage, those are really important jobs. I'm just saying that they be conscious about what they're doing. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. We have a question, Jeannine, for you specifically. I think it's from a fellow professor. How do you have time to ungrade? I was wondering that myself as you were talking about it.
Everybody leans in close. Well, that honestly was one of my concerns as well. It was a dual concern. Like if I really sort of relinquish this control, right, and share that power with the students, how will they use it, right? Which goes back to that idea of trusting. And I am seeing that trust is warranted. And how, oh my gosh, how do I have the time to do this? And the reality is that we're already mostly doing this. Right, because most of us, in addition to the rubric and the grade, give feedback, right? So what this actually ends up being is taking that, that power dynamic, and what is often anxiety producing for both the teacher and the student, which is that seemingly arbitrary, somewhat arbitrary number that gets assigned, right? And just doing the part that's fun, which is reading students' ideas and their work and engaging them in a conversation and giving them feedback. And so, yeah, I'm layering in a few extra assignments as far as these reflective journals and stuff like that. But they're short assignments. And again, they're really fun for me to read. And I get to know my students so much better and really engage in conversations that, again, are focusing them and centering them and their learning processes. And I get really honest response. You know, my time is really scattered, and I'm overstretched, and I'm anxious, and I'm stressed, and I haven't, you know, part of the reason this wasn't as good is because I just haven't had time to read, and here's what I'm going to try to do, right? So I start to get that level of understanding of where each of my individual students are coming from, so I can have this conversation with them, and then we can work together to think about how they can reach the goals that they have set for themselves. So I was really worried about that as well. But what I'm seeing is that ungrading is all of the really rewarding, awesome things about teaching without that extra anxiety that, you know, because everybody's, oh, I love teaching, but I hate grading, right? This allows you to keep the really cool part of grading, the fun part, the conversation with students.
It does sound like it can be a more enjoyable process than traditional forms of grading. We are almost out of time. We have just a few minutes left. I have a quick question that I'd like to ask Heather, and then we'll be wrapping up. Heather, in our new Zoom remote format, how are you creating community? You showed us some amazing pictures of travel abroad, but how is it happening virtually? How are you able to encourage students to develop community in this way?
So I'll make this as quick as possible. I'm doing a variation of a restorative justice circle. So we talk about, and we set up a virtual circle. So students, each time they do a check-in. So we know when we come into this space, this 2D space, where each of us is situated. And students get to hear from each other the stress that they're dealing with. They start to develop compassion for one another. So always a check-in, usually a check-out. And then we do explore what it means to be connected in dialogue explicitly. And it is working. Some of the classes may be too big online, so it's not exactly the quality that I would want. But in the classes that are, you know, that everybody is on one screen, it's truly amazing what this space means. And students are excited to get to class, and they talk about that because it's their space.
Yeah. Thank you. That's so helpful to know. Thank you both so much for presenting today. I feel like we really have an amazing understanding of what social justice means to you and how you actualize this at Roosevelt. So I feel like we lived up to our title of social justice through teaching and service. So thank you both very much. So that concludes our event today. Thank you everyone who joined us. A special thank you to Amy, Jeannine, and Heather. And I hope that you will all join us for another event in the near future. So take care.